Okay, so to the left are the parents of Yuji Itadori, and to the right is the amount of times they were mentioned in Jujutsu Kaisen. In the first episode, Yuji's grandpa tries to say what happened to them, but gets interrupted by his grandson who genuinely doesn't care. However, in today's video, we're breaking down all available evidence to explain why they went missing and also the timeline of events. To start things off, we know that Yuji's dad was a guy called Jin Itadori, who is not Sukuna's brother despite what you may have read. A big misconception is that Jin has the same soul as Sukuna, but this was debunked thanks to a special bonus page in volume 29 of JJK. To put it simply, 1,000 years ago, Sukuna had a twin brother who was then eaten and killed by Sukuna in the womb. In the modern day, the soul of that twin brother was reincarnated to Wasuke Itadori, aka Jin's dad and Yuji's granddad. Therefore, it's more accurate to say that Jin was Sukuna's nephew, and during the early 2000s, he married a sorcerer known as Kaori. Their marriage was confirmed in chapter 143 when Wasuke was referred to as being Kaori's father-in-law. This information is helpful because it shows us that if these two were serious enough to get married, then it's a safe bet that Jin knew about Jujutsu sorcery. For a bit of context here, Kaori had a powerful curse technique known as anti-gravity system with the power to both reverse or increase the effects of gravity. When used correctly, this technique can even help you survive getting sucked into a black hole, which is something we all have to deal with from time to time. With a technique this strong, it's highly possible that Kaori was on Jujutsu High's radar, similar to how Geto, Yuta, Todo, and others were all scouted by the school. Now, did Kaori work for Jujutsu High? No, not necessarily, but the point is that sorcerers with her talent, they don't go completely unnoticed. Logically, it's a fair assumption that at some point in her life, Kaori must have been involved in the Jujutsu world, whether that's as a student, a teacher, a curse user, or as a Jujutsu sorcerer. Regardless of what it may be, it's clear that through her and her gravity curse technique, Jin would have known about curse energy and the fact that curse techniques can be used to perform miracles. As the video goes on, we should all keep this in mind, but just before we move on, I want to address one potential plot hole. If we assume that Kaori was a former student or sorcerer at Jujutsu High, then how is it that no one knew who Itadori was? After all, Yuji was introduced as this random person who they just happened to find, but if Kaori was a friend of the school, then you'd assume that maybe Yaga or Gakuganji, they should be aware of him already. The easiest explanation is that if Kaori was ever involved with the school, then she must have left before getting married, and as a result of that, no one there knew about the Itadori family name. Considering how little staff Jujutsu High have, it's not like they track the movements of everyone who happens to leave, especially when that person isn't suspicious. Anyhow, now that we've established who Jin and Kaori are, it's time to break down why they would have been killed. Thanks to Yuji's grandpa, we know for a fact that Jin wanted a child, but for some reason that didn't happen with Kaori. Who knows, maybe it was a medical reason, or maybe she just didn't want kids. Either way, Jin couldn't fulfill his dream of being a dad. This is where Kenjaku comes in, because after waiting for the last 500 years, he knew that pretty soon he'd have the chance to accomplish his main goal. As a reminder, Kenjaku's main goal was to explore the limits of Jujutsu by merging the entire Japanese population with Tengen. Doing this would create a monster that's never been seen in history, but the problem is that Kenjaku can only try this once every 500 years. Many of you know why, but just for those who don't, the reason Kenjaku has to wait 500 years is because that's how long it takes for Tengen to evolve. Only in her evolved form can she be merged with the rest of Japan, and Kenjaku knew that if everything went his way, then Tengen would start evolving in the year 2006. Therefore, rewinding back to when Jin wanted a child, Kenjaku was already in the background making preparations for his goal. One of those preparations was directly related to Jin, and to explain why, there are a couple things we need to know. Firstly, 500 years ago, Kenjaku thought he did everything to make his plan succeed, but he was surprisingly beaten by one of Gojo's ancestors. This defeat taught him a super valuable lesson, which is that it's pointless to try and kill someone who has the six eyes and the limitless curse technique. As fully grown adults, they're just way too powerful for him to beat, and even if he kills them as children, which he did, then a new six eyes will be born shortly after. To get around this, Kenjaku changed his plan, and following his defeat, he began searching for the prison realm. This cursed object would be able to trap the six eyes regardless of their strength, but for centuries he still couldn't find it. In the 21st century, we know for a fact that Kenjaku was still searching, however, like any mastermind, he needed a backup plan to deal with Gojo. By now, he was well aware that he'd never beat a six eyes user in combat, but in the past, he revealed the strongest sorcerer he's ever met was actually Sukuna. If anyone in history could win against Gojo, then Sukuna by far had the best chance, and it just so happens that Kenjaku had Sukuna's soul in his possession. This brings us to the second thing we need to know, which is that to achieve his goal of merging Tengen with Japan, Kenjaku had to do a ritual known as the Culling Games. This ritual is where he'd force a ton of sorcerers to fight each other, and in the process, it'd generate enough curse energy to do the merger. Over the generations, Kenjaku convinced tons of people to sign up with the promise that he'd bring them all back to life in the future. Among this group was Sukuna, but due to his strength, Kenjaku saw him as more than just a Culling Game player. The villain knew that regardless of what happens in the future, having Sukuna around would give him way more options. One example of this is how he used Sukuna's return as a way to get closer to Mahito's group, and he even got them to steal some fingers from Jujutsu High. Of course, there are other examples too, but the point is that Sukuna could be useful to him before the Culling Games. The problem is that because of Sukuna's personality, he just always does what he wants, and in the modern day that would get him killed. If the King of Curses had had full control from the beginning, then it's undeniable Jujutsu High would have destroyed him before he'd have the chance to regain all 20 fingers. For that reason, Kenjaku's best option was to bring Sukuna back, but inside a vessel that would force him to slow down. With his movements being restricted, it was feasible that he wouldn't be killed straight away, and with any luck, he'd have time to regain most of his power. With that explained, we now know why Kenjaku would want to create a strong vessel, and to make that happen, he targeted the Itadori family. Somehow, the villain must have found out that Wasuke is Sukuna's reincarnated twin, and it's worth remembering that in the Jujutsu world, twins are considered to share the same soul. In that sense, we can think of Wasuke as literally being Sukuna, or rather he's a version of Sukuna that's actually a normal person. Either way, Kenjaku wanted some of that DNA, but Wasuke was clearly too old to be useful. On the other hand, Jin was young and eager to have a child, and to make things even better, his wife was blessed with a strong technique. That rare opportunity was all Kenjaku needed to see, and at some point in the early 2000s, Kaori died. Not only did she die, but it seems like her death wasn't a secret. I mean, in this chapter, Wasuke openly mentions it to Jin. Judging from the way he's talking, it's clear that both he and his son should be aware she died, but for some reason, Jin doesn't acknowledge this. For me personally, I think there are 3 realistic theories to explain Jin's behavior, one of which is related to Yuji. If we start with the facts, we know for sure that after Kaori's death, Kenjaku used his technique to take over her body. We also know, based on Wasuke's statement, that Jin should be fully aware that his wife passed away. Why then is Jin seemingly okay with her being a zombie? Well, theory number 1 is that he genuinely believes that this is his wife. Earlier on, we explained that Jin probably knows about Jujutsu even if he wasn't a sorcerer himself, and assuming that he had basic knowledge, he'd know that reverse curse technique is a thing. At its best, reverse curse technique can heal someone who appears to be dead, and if Jin was desperate enough, he might have been willing to believe that that's how Kaori came back to life. Obviously, Wasuke didn't believe any nonsense like that, but for a grieving husband, you can imagine him deluding himself into thinking Kaori healed. A much darker theory is that Kenjaku made a deal with Jin, similar to the one that Sukuna made with Yuji. Back in season 1, we learned that binding vows can be used to make someone forget something, as long as both people agree. On that basis, what if Kenjaku offered Jin the chance to have a baby with Kaori, and in exchange, Jin would forget that his real wife is actually dead? If that was the case, it would explain a lot, but we have to assume that Jin has enough cursed energy to take part in a binding vow. As far as I know, Jujutsu Kaisen never specified how much CE you need to make a binding vow, but based on how common they are, it is likely that you don't need that much. Finally, the last realistic theory is that Jin knows this isn't his wife, or he suspects it's not his wife, but he simply tries not to think about it. Evidence for this can be seen in his interaction with Wasuke, where Jin immediately threatens to leave if his dad mentions Kaori. This shows us that he's not willing to think deeply about the situation, maybe because he knows the reality is terrifying. Regardless of the answer, what we know for sure is that in this body, Kenjaku did unspeakable things with Jin. As a direct result, the villain became pregnant, showing that this character really is willing to try anything. In order to guarantee that her child would be a strong vessel, Kenjaku got one of Sukuna's fingers and sealed it inside of the fetus. This meant that Yuji was born with one of these things already in him, which helps to explain his ridiculous physical stats. Now, when we examine the timeline, shortly after Yuji's birth in March 2003, it's clear that Kenjaku had no interest in raising him. There are several ways we can prove this, but if we start with the most obvious one, Yuji was entirely brought up by his granddad. In chapter 265, he explained that he and Wasuke moved to a small town where they lived until Yuji was around 6 or 7 years old. While they were there, he said that his granddad did things for him in place of his real parents, proving that both Jin and Kaori weren't in the picture. In Kaori's case, we do know she was busy. For example, she was still searching for the prison realm, which she eventually found in the year 2012. By that point, Yuji would have been around 8 or 9 years old, and he and his grandpa had moved back to Sendai City. This city is where Kenjaku gave birth to him, and unknown to Yuji, his mother was secretly observing him. For instance, in chapter 160, Kenjaku personally thanked Sasuke for getting along with his son, showing that he paid attention to Yuji's life and he did care on a very basic level. Of course, another person who cared was Jin, who was missing from his son's life despite wanting a child. If we think about this for a second, if Kenjaku was fine with Yuji being raised by his granddad, then why would he have any problems with Yuji being raised by Jin? To answer that question, we should look at chapter 191 to understand how Kenjaku thinks in these situations. For context, this chapter is when he took control of the Kamo clan and was then confronted by Noritoshi. Lawfully speaking, it was Noritoshi who should be the next leader of the Kamo clan, and so in this moment, it made perfect sense for them to fight and for Kenjaku to kill him. Despite that, the villain freely chose to leave Noritoshi alive because he didn't see him as a threat. In other words, Kenjaku isn't going to just kill you for no reason, and if he does kill someone, it's either because, they have something he wants, either it's necessary for the plan, or it's because, that person might one day be a threat. The question is, which of these categories does Jin fall into for his wife to have made him disappear? Before we get to the answer, if you want to look good and support this channel at the same time, then you should grab one of these Maharaga hats that you can see on screen. Not only does this design act like a bat symbol to other JJK fans, but the quality of the stitching is also great. Recently, I loved wearing it myself on a recent trip to visit some family, and I want all of you to look as happy as I look in this photo. Yeah, I might not be smiling at all, but trust me, on the inside, I was having a great time. The link to buy a hat is in the description, and it may even be on screen if I did this correctly, so if you want one, then you should get one ASAP. Moving on, assuming you just bought one of the caps, let's move on to why Kenjaku would want to get rid of Jin. As far as we know, Jin wasn't a powerful sorcerer, so he likely wasn't a threat to Kenjaku in that way. However, he might have been a threat to the overall plan. Remember, after Yuji was born, Kenjaku still had a ton of things to do. For instance, he had to find Mahito, but didn't know exactly when Mahito would manifest again. He also needed a method of controlling curses, he also needed to locate the prison realm as we know, and he needed Tengen not to merge with Riko Amanai. That's a lot of different things that had to go his way, and so it's not like he could waste years of his life pretending to be a real mother. The issue is that it seems like Jin believes this is his wife. Whether that's due to denial, delusion, or a binding vow, he acts like there's nothing wrong with Kaori. In the beginning, this would have been great for Kenjaku since they were able to make Yuji, but afterwards, it makes it difficult to just leave. After all, Kenjaku's whole thing is that he observes from a distance and he only reveals himself when the time is right. But in this case, if Kaori had just vanished, her husband would make it a big deal. Who knows, maybe Jin even would have contacted Jujutsu High to help look for her. We don't know the possibilities, all we do know is that Jin wouldn't have just accepted it. Whatever he could potentially do, that could bring unwanted attention that might even force Kenjaku to switch bodies. And to avoid all of this trouble, the much easier solution is just to get rid of Jin. If she did that, no one would ever search for her, especially not Wasuke, who knew just how dangerous she was. In this body that she had clearly gotten used to, Kenjaku could manipulate events from behind the scenes and then wait until the right opportunity to switch. By using this body, she could hold on to the anti-gravity technique for as long as possible, because if you just keep switching and switching and switching, then you are going to lose that technique. And so by staying with this body up until Geto, it meant that all those years later, anti-gravity was still a thing he could use. For me, this is the most likely motivation for why Jin would be killed. However, there are some other potential explanations. One theory was that if Jin realizes that Kaori is someone else, or if he even suspects it, then from Kenjaku's point of view, it's just too risky to let him raise Yuji. The reason is that for Yuji to serve his purpose as a vessel and a culling game player, he literally has to stay in Japan. However, if Jin found out that his wife was a living corpse, then yeah, that might not happen, because anyone in this situation would be justified in leaving the country and just running away. If I was Kenjaku, there's two things I'd do to avoid this. The first would be to eliminate Jin and then tell Wasuke why I did it, so that he'd never be tempted to take Yuji too far away. There were a couple other theories I had for why Jin went missing, including him potentially dying from breaking a binding vow, or, potentially going into a coma after being fed a cursed object. But with those theories, there were certain inconsistencies that made me think they are really unlikely. Truthfully, based on everything we've discussed in this video, my most plausible explanation for the whole timeline is that in the early 2000s, Kaori and Jin did get married, but she was killed by Kenjaku in either 2001 or 2002. Although Wasuke realized this was no longer the same person, this wasn't the case with Jin, who in his desperation agreed to a binding vow where he would forget that his wife died on the condition that he could have the child he wanted. In 2003, the new Kaori then gave birth to Yuji, and with that mission complete, the villain wanted to move on to finding the prison realm among other things. To avoid anyone trying to search for her, Kenjaku killed Jin, leading to Yuji being raised by his granddad. In 2006, Tengen then began evolving, and 6 years after that, Kaori found the one thing she needed to seal Gojo. 5 years later, Suguru Geto was killed in December of 2017, and since Gojo refused to destroy the body, Kenjaku was finally able to switch. With the pieces nearly in place, in 2018, Kenjaku placed one of Sukuna's fingers at Yuji's school, knowing that it would attract curses and other things. As expected, Yuji was the one who then found it, but to his credit, he didn't eat it straight away. Instead, he gave it to his friends, but I guess he couldn't override his programming because yeah, in the end, he does eat it. This moment causes Sukuna to awaken, and all the other fingers wake up as well. Following that, we get pretty much all of the events of Jujutsu Kaisen, with Jin nowhere to be seen because he's dead. With that said, those are my thoughts on who the Itadoris are and why they went missing, and if you made it this far, then be sure to like the video, subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and buy one of these caps if you think they look good. As always, thank you for watching, and until the next one, peace out.